I can still remember the first time I laid eyes on Agnes Fisher. I'd been working as an in-home nurse for years, bouncing from family to family, caring for elderly folks who needed help with day-to-day stuff. I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened in that house in Pennsylvania. My husband, Jimmy, had passed 15 years ago. He'd taken his own life. It was the hardest thing I'd ever been through, and even now, it felt like an open wound that would never heal. Losing him made me throw myself into my work. It was the only thing that kept me going. But looking back, I wonder if maybe I was running away from the memories. Trying to stay busy, you know? Anyway, that's how I found myself in that old, creaky farmhouse, agreeing to take care of Agnes, an 80-year-old woman who'd been diagnosed with severe dementia and multiple personality disorder. Her family had moved her into this big, empty place out in the middle of nowhere, thinking maybe the quiet would calm her down. And to be honest, the money was good, and I thought the change of pace might be good for me too. Agnes was different from any patient I'd ever cared for. Every day, it seemed like she was a new person. Some days she'd call herself Mary, and she'd sit by the window, knitting and muttering about her baby that she'd lost years ago. Other days she'd be Catherine, laughing with this sharp, almost menacing sound, recounting stories that were decades older than she was. I knew dementia could be hard on a person's mind, make them lose touch with who they were, but this was something else entirely. Each personality felt too real, too distinct, like Agnes was actually becoming someone else every day. At first, I told myself it was just a job. My only role was to make sure she was fed, clean, and safe. But there was an energy in that house, something heavy, oppressive. The kind of feeling you get when someone's watching you, even though you're alone. And every day, I'd catch Agnes watching me from the corner of her eye, almost like she was sizing me up. I tried not to let it get to me, but there were nights I'd go home and barely sleep, wondering what it was about that house, or about Agnes herself. Then, one morning, I came in to check on her, just like any other day. I was getting her breakfast ready when she looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen on her before. Her eyes were cold, intense, like she was seeing right through me. It was unsettling, to say the least. "Didn't think I'd see you again, sweetheart," she said, her voice low and rough, not her usual tone at all. I froze, my hand still holding the tray. "Agnes?" I asked, feeling a shiver run down my spine. "It's me, Molly." She chuckled, but it was a sound that didn't belong to an old woman. It was deep, almost familiar, and it made my stomach twist. "It's me, Jimmy. Didn't you miss me?" My heart stopped. There was no way she could have known that name. I'd never mentioned my husband to her or anyone in her family. And yet, here she was, staring at me with a look that felt all too familiar. I tried to shake it off, forcing a laugh. "Agnes, you're confused. It's me, Molly, your nurse." She just stared at me, her gaze unblinking. "I remember the day you met me, Molly. You wore that green dress I always loved. Don't you remember? We danced till the sun came up. You're still my girl, even now." My blood ran cold. She was describing the night I'd met Jimmy, down to the smallest detail. That green dress, it was something only he would remember. I set the tray down on the table, my hands shaking. "Agnes, this isn't funny," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She leaned back, that strange smile still on her face. "It's me, honey. Don't you see? I came back. I promised you, didn't I?" I stumbled back, heart pounding, and for the first time, I realized I might be in over my head. Whatever was happening in that house, it wasn't normal. I'd signed up to care for a confused old woman. I hadn't signed up for this. I tried to brush it off as just another one of Agnes's episodes. That's what I told myself, anyway. But her voice, her gaze, it felt too real. It felt like Jimmy, like he was somehow there. I left the house that night, replaying every word she'd said. The way she'd spoken about that green dress, our dance, the way she'd called me sweetheart. It was like hearing a ghost. I thought maybe a good night's sleep would clear my head. But sleep didn't come easy, not with Jimmy's face flickering in my mind, the way it had that day. The day I'd found him. That image had haunted me for years, and Agnes's words had ripped it open like a fresh wound. The next morning, I went back to Agnes's house, bracing myself for another strange encounter. But when I walked in, she was back to her usual self, frail, quiet, staring out the window as if nothing had happened. I let out a sigh of relief, telling myself it had all been in my head. But the peace didn't last. A few days later, I found her in the hallway, pacing back and forth, muttering under her breath. Her movements were strange, almost stiff, like she was someone else entirely. She looked up as I approached, and I felt my stomach twist. "Molly," she said, her voice deeper than usual. "You remember that trip we took up to the mountains? You were afraid of heights, but I told you I'd be there, holding your hand the whole way." My heart skipped a beat. Jimmy had said those exact words to me on a trip we'd taken, years before he died. I felt a lump in my throat, fighting back tears. "Agnes, how do you know that?" She just smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent chills through me. "You and I were meant to be, Molly. Even now, I'm here for you. I'll always be here." I backed away, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. It wasn't just that she knew these things, these intimate, private details. It was the way she spoke, the look in her eyes. It was like Jimmy was staring right back at me. I left early that day, telling myself I was coming down with something. But no amount of rest could shake the feeling that something dark had taken hold of that house, and of Agnes. That night, I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, thinking about Agnes's words. Her eyes, her tone, the way she'd seemed to shift into someone else. I wondered if I was losing my mind, or if maybe I'd somehow let Jimmy's memory seep too deep into my heart, until it had started to blur the lines between past and present. Just as I was finally drifting off, a voice cut through the silence. It was low, whispering, and at first I thought it was coming from outside my window. But then I heard it again, soft, insistent, almost like a prayer. "Molly, my love, come to me." I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. The voice sounded just like Jimmy's, and it was coming from inside my room. I looked around, feeling my pulse race, half expecting to see him standing there in the shadows. But the room was empty. Then I saw her, Agnes. She was standing at the foot of my bed, her hands clasped in front of her, whispering something I couldn't quite make out. Her eyes were closed, her expression peaceful, almost serene. And as I watched, she began to murmur a prayer, her voice so soft it was barely audible. "Dear Lord, guide my beloved home," she whispered, her voice a blend of sorrow and longing. "May his soul find rest, and may he watch over the one he loves." My throat went dry. I knew that prayer. It was the one I'd said for Jimmy, every night for months after he died, hoping he'd somehow hear me, hoping he'd find peace. I hadn't told a soul about that prayer, and yet here she was, reciting it word for word, like she'd been there with me all those nights. I wanted to scream, to tell her to leave, but I was paralyzed, frozen in place. All I could do was watch as she finished the prayer, opened her eyes, and looked right at me. "It's me, Molly," she whispered, a tear sliding down her cheek. "I came back for you." The room spun, and I felt a surge of panic, like I was losing my grip on reality. Agnes, Jimmy, whoever she was, reached out, her hand brushing against mine, her touch ice cold. I yanked my hand back, scrambling out of bed, my heart racing. "Get out!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "Leave me alone!" But she just stood there, her eyes sad, almost pleading. "I'm here, Molly," she said softly. "I promised I'd never leave." And then, as quickly as she'd appeared, she was gone. The room was empty, the air still, but I could still feel her presence lingering, like a shadow that wouldn't fade. I stayed up the rest of the night, terrified to close my eyes, terrified of what I might see if I did. I'd thought I was strong enough to handle anything, but this was something beyond me, something I couldn't explain. The next day, I made an appointment with a therapist. I needed answers, some way to make sense of what was happening. Because whatever was going on with Agnes, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in that house. And it wasn't just Agnes I was seeing. I walked into the therapist's office like I was on autopilot. My head was spinning, my body running on fumes, and I couldn't stop replaying the night before in my mind, Agnes standing at the foot of my bed, whispering that prayer, reaching out to me with Jimmy's voice. My chest tightened every time I thought about it, the way her words had felt like they were coming from him. The therapist, Dr. Peters, was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a soft voice. I half expected her to laugh me out of the room when I started talking, but she just nodded, her gaze steady and sympathetic. "It sounds like you're experiencing something deeply unsettling, Molly," she said when I finished. "Losing a spouse, especially in the way you did, leaves a mark. Sometimes, our memories play tricks on us, especially when we're surrounded by reminders of them." I nodded, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. It wasn't just memories. It was something else, something that was reaching out to me through Agnes, twisting reality until I couldn't tell where the past ended and the present began. "What about Agnes?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "How does she know things that only Jimmy would know?" Dr. Peters looked thoughtful, folding her hands in her lap. "People with certain cognitive conditions, especially those as complex as Agnes's, can sometimes pick up on emotional cues, things that they shouldn't be able to know but do. It's rare, but it happens." She paused, then added, "Or if I may suggest, perhaps Agnes is acting as a kind of vessel for your grief. You said she has multiple personality disorder, which can create very vivid, sometimes unpredictable identities. Is it possible that your mind is projecting your husband onto her as a way of processing your unresolved emotions?" I didn't know what to think. It was a comforting explanation, one that made sense logically, but it didn't feel right. Every time I looked into Agnes's eyes, every time she spoke in that deep, familiar voice, it felt like Jimmy was right there in the room with me. I left the session with more questions than answers, but I promised myself I'd stay grounded. Dr. Peters had told me to keep a journal, to write down everything that happened, as a way to separate fact from feeling. It was a good idea, and it made me feel like I had some control. But that night, as I walked back into the house, I felt that same heavy, suffocating presence waiting for me. Agnes was in her room when I arrived, sitting up in bed, her eyes unfocused, staring out the window into the dark. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and stepped inside. "Good evening, Agnes," I said, forcing a smile. She turned to look at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Her gaze was cold, distant, like she didn't recognize me at all. For a moment I thought she might be slipping into one of her other personalities, but then she spoke, her voice soft and strangely familiar. "I've been waiting for you, Molly," she said, her tone low and steady. My heart raced, and I took a step back. "Agnes, do you know who I am?" She tilted her head, a faint smile curling at her lips. "I know you better than anyone. You're my wife. You're the one who swore to stay by my side, remember?" I clenched my fists, trying to keep my voice steady. "Agnes, you're confused. I'm your nurse, not your wife." But she just laughed, a hollow, humorless sound that made my skin crawl. "You can't run from me, Molly. I told you I'd always be here. Even in death, I'd find a way." My throat tightened. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, as she stared at me with that piercing gaze, like she was reaching right into my soul. "Jimmy," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Is that you?" She nodded slowly, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. "It's me, Molly. You thought you could escape, thought you could start fresh. But I'm part of you, and you're part of me. We're bound together, even now." I backed out of the room, my heart pounding, feeling like the walls were closing in on me. I stumbled into the hallway, my mind reeling, struggling to process what was happening. I'd gone through every possible explanation, every rational answer, but nothing fit. Nothing could explain the way she spoke, the way she seemed to know things only Jimmy would know. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the living room couch, watching the door to Agnes's room, waiting for her to come out. But she didn't. The house was silent, almost too silent, and I felt trapped, caught in a nightmare that wouldn't let me go. The next day, I went to see Dr. Peters again. I told her everything, how Agnes had spoken to me in Jimmy's voice, how she'd known things about our past, things that no one else could possibly know. Dr. Peters listened, her face calm, but I could see a flicker of concern in her eyes. "Molly," she said gently, "sometimes grief can create very real experiences, things that feel as vivid as anything else. It doesn't mean they're actually happening." I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it, that Jimmy was somehow reaching out to me through Agnes. The thought terrified me, but it also filled me with a strange kind of hope. Maybe he wasn't gone after all. Maybe, in some strange, twisted way, he'd come back. But as I left Dr. Peters' office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking back into something far darker, something I couldn't understand or control. I didn't know if I was seeing Jimmy or just losing my mind, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was waiting for me in that house, it wasn't done with me yet. I didn't want to go back to the house. I knew that deep down. But there was a pull, something that made it impossible for me to stay away. It was like Jimmy's memory had taken root in that place, growing stronger each day, binding me to it. I thought of Dr. Peters' advice, to write everything down, to ground myself in reality. But the more time I spent in that house, the harder it became to tell what was real and what was something else. When I walked through the front door that night, I was met with silence, thick, oppressive silence that seemed to press down on me from all sides. I set my things down, trying to steady my breath, and walked toward Agnes's room. I felt like I was moving in slow motion, each step taking me deeper into a darkness I couldn't escape. When I reached her door, I hesitated. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking as I reached for the doorknob. Part of me wanted to turn around, to run and never look back, but I couldn't. Something was waiting for me on the other side of that door, something I had to face. I opened the door and found Agnes sitting in her armchair, staring out the window. The moonlight cast an eerie glow across her face, making her look older, almost spectral. She didn't acknowledge me, didn't move. She just sat there, silent and still, like she was waiting. "Agnes?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't respond, didn't even turn her head. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening, and noticed something strange. She was holding a small object in her lap, cradling it like it was the most precious thing in the world. It was a noose. The blood drained from my face as I recognized it, the rope frayed and worn, just like the one Jimmy had used. I hadn't seen it since that day. How did she have it? How did it end up in her hands? My throat tightened, my body frozen as she looked up at me, her eyes empty, hollow. "You remember this, don't you, Molly?" she said, her voice low, almost a growl. "This is what you found that day. This is what took me from you." My knees went weak, and I had to steady myself against the doorframe. "Agnes, how do you have that? Why are you doing this?" She laughed, a cold, empty sound that sent chills down my spine. "Because you didn't listen, Molly. You didn't believe I'd come back. But I told you. I told you I'd find a way." I shook my head, trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to spill over. "Jimmy's gone, Agnes. He's gone. This isn't real." She rose from the chair, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was savoring every step. "I'm here, Molly. I've always been here, watching, waiting for the right moment." She held out the noose, her eyes fixed on mine. "You never said goodbye." I took a step back, my heart racing, but she followed, her gaze piercing, unyielding. "Why did you leave me, Molly? Why did you let me go?" "I didn't," I whispered, the tears finally spilling over. "I didn't want to lose you." She was so close now, her face inches from mine, and I could feel the cold radiating from her, seeping into my bones. "Then come with me," she whispered, her voice soft, almost gentle. "We can be together again, just like we were before." I felt her hand close around mine, her grip cold and unyielding, and I couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in, the darkness swallowing us both. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen, trapped in her gaze, caught between the past and the present. Then, suddenly, she let go, and I stumbled back, gasping for air. Agnes's face softened, her expression shifting, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She blinked, looking around the room as if she'd just woken from a dream. "Molly?" she said, her voice small, confused. What's happening?" I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. "Agnes, it's okay. It's just us." She looked down at the noose in her hands, her face pale, horrified. I didn't mean to." Her voice trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. In that moment, she was Agnes again, fragile, lost, scared. I felt a surge of pity, mixed with something else, something darker. But before I could speak, her face twisted, her eyes glazing over as she clutched the noose to her chest. "No," she mumbled, her voice deep, resonant, like it was coming from somewhere else. "I'll never leave you, Molly. I'll always be here, waiting." And just like that, she was gone again, her body slumping back into the chair, the noose slipping from her hands. The room fell silent, the air thick with a presence I couldn't see but could feel, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. I backed out of the room, my body numb, my mind reeling. Whatever was happening in that house, it was beyond anything I could understand. I needed to get out, needed to leave before it consumed me. But as I reached the door, a voice echoed through the hallway, low, mournful, a whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Goodbye, Molly." I ran, not stopping until I was outside, the cold night air filling my lungs as I stumbled into the darkness. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I left the house, left Agnes, and I never returned. I left Pennsylvania not long after that night. I didn't even go back to collect my things. Whatever belongings I'd left behind felt like a small price to pay for the peace of mind I hoped to find. I took the first train out, watching the landscape blur past me as I tried to leave every trace of that house, of Agnes, and of Jimmy behind. But some things follow you, even when you try to run. It's been 15 years since that night, and I've built a new life in a different country. I've moved on in most ways. I have a new job, new friends, a different home. But I still think about that house, about the things I saw, the things Agnes said to me, words that only Jimmy would have known. For a long time, I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was the stress, the grief I'd never properly dealt with. Maybe Agnes had picked up on it, in some strange, subconscious way, like Dr. Peters suggested. But late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm alone, I can still feel that chill, that cold presence that never fully left me. Sometimes, I hear his voice in my dreams, calling to me just like he did that night. "Goodbye, Molly." The words echo in my mind, soft and sad, as if he's still out there, somewhere, waiting. I've tried to talk to people about it, therapists and close friends, but I've never told them the full story. Some things are too strange, too painful, to share. They wouldn't understand, the way Agnes's eyes would change, how she would shift between herself and him. How she knew things that no one else could know. Even now, there are nights when I wake up, feeling that same weight pressing down on me, that heavy presence lingering in the shadows. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, it feels as real as it did that night. I'll sit up, my heart pounding, half expecting to see Agnes standing at the foot of my bed, her face shifting, her voice deep and familiar, calling out to me. But the room is always empty. I don't know if it was Jimmy reaching out to me that night, or if something darker had taken hold of Agnes, something that wanted to use his memory to keep me there, tied to the past. All I know is, whatever it was, it knew me, knew my pain, my loss, and it used that to hold on to me. Maybe one day, I'll find the courage to go back, to face whatever remains in that house. Maybe I'll finally find the answers I'm looking for, the closure I've needed all these years. But for now, I'm content to leave the past where it is, buried, forgotten, or at least as forgotten as it can be. As I write this, I feel a strange sense of calm, like I'm finally letting go of something that's haunted me for too long. But as I close the journal, I can't shake the feeling that, somewhere out there, Agnes, or Jimmy, or whatever had taken hold of them both, is still waiting. Watching. And maybe, just maybe, one day I'll have to face it again. Until then, I'll keep moving forward, keep living, and keep telling myself that whatever was in that house is gone. But in the quiet, in the silence of the darkest nights, I still hear it. Welcome to Story Scary Boo. We are dedicated to sharing immersive and authentic stories, presented as true experiences submitted by individuals from various backgrounds. Our goal is to provide engaging and thought-provoking content that explores the mysterious, the unsettling, and the unexplained. Each story on this channel is presented as a true account, rooted in the experiences of those who have faced unusual or eerie situations. While we ensure these stories remain true to their origins, minor creative adjustments may be made to enhance clarity and emotional impact. However, we are committed to maintaining the integrity and intent of each story, treating each subject matter with the respect and sincerity it deserves. We take YouTube's policies very seriously. All content shared on this channel is carefully reviewed to comply with YouTube's community guidelines and content standards. We avoid graphic or harmful details, ensuring that our storytelling is suitable for a wide audience. Content involving sensitive or potentially distressing themes is handled with care, keeping our viewers' comfort in mind. Our stories often delve into the supernatural and explore unsettling topics that may not be suitable for everyone. We recommend viewer discretion, especially for those sensitive to themes of the paranormal or psychological suspense. Our goal is to deliver content that is both respectful and captivating, with a focus on creating a safe, welcoming environment for all viewers. We value your feedback and are constantly striving to improve our content. If you have concerns, suggestions, or personal stories to share, please feel free to reach out. We are committed to creating content that is engaging, respectful, and aligned with YouTube's standards. Thank you for being part of our community, and for joining us on this journey into the unknown.